So again, a very warm welcome from my side. I'm Christine. I'm the host for the session from the Global Peter Drucker Forum. I'm excited to have this amazing panel and the moderator with us to talk about important topics all around data and AI. Thank you so much for your time and for being here. I would like to encourage you to use the chat function throughout the whole session. You can pose your questions in there to the speakers and the moderator will just pick them up. Also, we have the opportunity for our live stream audience who's also joining us here to post their questions on Slido with the hashtag #DruckerForum. Just choose the right session and pose your question there. And without any further ado, I want to hand over to our amazing panel and our moderator, Julia Kirby. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome everyone. This is, I would say, my absolute favorite panel on this year's Drucker Forum program. So it's a great honor and pleasure for me to get to host it. I'm also on the program steering committee of the Drucker Forum, so I can give a little context as to what we had in mind here. You know, when we decided to create this year's theme, that it would be all about leadership. Leadership everywhere is the theme of the entire conference. That immediately raises this question of, is there actually anything new to say about leadership? Are there new challenges? You know, research into leaders and commentary about leadership is, I would say, probably the very same age as leadership itself. And so it's easy to think there's nothing new under the sun to be said about it. But as we thought about it, and then as we experienced this year, I think we realized, no, there really is a huge amount that we can cover in this entire conference that constitutes new challenges for leaders in enterprises. And a very big one is this rise of analytics, data modeling, and now increasingly the introduction of artificial intelligence into the operations of enterprises. So we did see this quite dramatically this year, a sort of case study in leadership and the extent to which leaders were feeling the pressure and feeling the desire to be more data-driven in their decision-making. It was very interesting to me just to, in the course of this pandemic, to see this historical comment about just over 100 years ago in the midst of the Spanish flu, this little data point that Woodrow Wilson, in the entire course of the Spanish flu as president of the United States, never made a statement about the flu from the Oval Office or any stump speech. He did not comment on the Spanish flu, even when in the month of October, 102 years ago, 195,000 Americans died in just that 1 month. So what's changed, you know, that leaders now couldn't possibly ignore, obfuscate, whatever it was he was doing with the pandemic? Well, of course, the difference is that we now live in this highly transparent world of data, modeling, data-driven decision-making, and the expectation of all of that. So with us today, we have 4 terrific commentators who are going to talk about how they see the new challenges to leadership presented by this data-filled world we live in. I'll just quickly rattle off their names and affiliations, assuming you can check out their bios in more detail for yourself. David Weinberger is at the Harvard Klein Center for Internet and Society. I've known David for many years. I think the first time I met him was when the book, The Clue Train Manifesto, came out. That wasn't yesterday, but probably a lot of people listening in have read that book. and much more recently, he published Everyday Chaos. He's trained as a philosopher. I think we're going to get, and of course, he's a very tech savvy person. We're going to get an interesting perspective from him. Miriam Meckel is the founding publisher of Ada, which is a platform for digital life. She's done that within under the kind of the banner of Handelsblatt Media Group. Charles-Édouard Bouée, I first met when he was CEO of Roland Berger, I should say. I always want to francophile it, but Berger. And but since has founded Alpha Intelligence Capital, which puts him in the business of investing in tech startups, and one can only assume providing some advice to their leaders as well. And Alex Adamopoulos, CEO of Emergn Limited, a consultancy that, and I love the way they describe their approach. It's an education-led transformation approach that they take with clients. And I think he's going to give us an education-led introduction to what he's learned about our topic today. So before we get going, and I'm going to, in a moment, ask everyone to give us some opening statements. I would love if we could just do a temperature check with a poll of the people listening in. Christine, I don't know if you can pop up the poll that we had in mind.
Yes, we are setting it up as we speak. Do you want to repeat the question as well, Julia?
Yeah, sure. This is just your opinion going into this session. How much should leaders be guided in their decision-making by data and models? And here was kind of our attempt at a Likert scale, I guess you could say. Should we be very much in the mode at this point in the history of the world that, look, we have the data, we can do this. We should not be relying on gut feel, I guess is maybe how you would interpret the first one. And then at the bottom, it's the opposite, which would say, look, the reason you make the big bucks as a leader is for your good judgment. Data does need to play its role in the workings of the organization, but as a leader, the things that escalate to you should maybe not be so data driven. So I'm looking at the poll results as they come in real time. We'll give you just another 10 seconds, I guess, to make your choice.
We can see that we have around 70% of people who already voted. So if you want to make your vote now, you can. We're just going to wait for a few moments. All right, I think we can end the poll.
Great, we're pulling the trigger on this poll where we have a very neat 2/3 of our listening audience saying that we should be following the science on a daily basis, that the role of a leader now has a lot to do with deferring to data-driven models. And so it'll be interesting to see if we all believe that as much at the end of this session, or we won't retake the poll, but kind of file away. How did I think at the beginning of this session? And then at the end, maybe reflect, was my thinking changed in any way? So with that, David, could you start us off with a kind of a point of view, your take on the questions that we've put on the table?
David, you're currently still muted. So if you check the bar below, you should see a microphone symbol.
I know.
Here we go.
In the US, we would say, okay, boomer, okay, old man, you're still muted. And I promise you that there will be at least another 2 occasions where I make this mistake today. So I'm really thrilled to be here as the Drucker Forum, amazing panelists. And I think what I want to say is that we've always been overwhelmed by information. This is completely not new, but our old strategy, our old technique has been to throw out information until we get it down to what we can manage. And we are not doing that nearly as much anymore. And this is, I think, for two reasons. The first is that we've been living online for a generation. And the second is the rise of machine learning, which I am very, very enthusiastic about. So life on the internet, it's characterized by a few things. Everybody here knows this, of course, but there's way too much stuff, too much information, too many links. It's almost completely unpredictable. So if you can predict what your browsing history is going to be at the end of the day, you can predict, sorry, at the beginning of the day, if you could predict what it's going to be, then you are way more in control of things than almost all of us. So internet is unpredictable, and we like it for that. That's one of the reasons we spend so much time on it. And also on the internet, small events can set off incalculably larger events, and nobody knows why. And the easiest example or version of this is when things go viral. Nobody knows why. Some kid in a basement makes a little video and suddenly it's everywhere and possibly changing the world. And these are all things that we like. There's too much, it's unpredictable. What is in effect the butterfly effect, that is small events triggering much larger ones unpredictably. These are all characteristics of chaos theory. It was sort of the 1970s when chaos theory emerged. So we have now been living in the chaotic world that chaos theory described. We've gotten used to it, and generally we like it. We know there are huge problems, but obviously. So we've gotten used to this sense of being overwhelmed and sort of getting okay with it. The second thing that I think is going on is the rise of machine learning, the type of AI known as machine learning, which works because it is able to embrace this sort of chaotic, overwhelming mass of data and use it to find correlations among little pieces of data that maybe nobody expected, and they are always probabilistic and statistical and of varying degrees of reliability. And for me, maybe the most interesting thing is the way in which a set of small weightings, small probabilities can, in some configurations, produce a prediction that is both unexpected and correct and inexplicable. It's just, we can't hold enough in our heads to see how all of the little factors interacted, just as we cannot predict what's going to go viral. So I think that I think we are fully now embracing chaos, the sort of chaos that chaos theory is talking about. And I want to point to three things I think are going on that are a response to this, and I think should be a response to it. The first is the rise of unanticipation as a strategy, because anticipating and preparing has been our strategy of strategies, literally since Paleolithic times. But now I'm going to give you three quick examples online of unanticipation becoming the best strategy. And all of these are familiar to you, so I can be fast. But the rise of minimum viable products, where rather than anticipating what your market's going to need, you introduce a product that has the minimum set of features that will enable you to charge money for it, and then you watch and see, rather than trying to anticipate what your users want or don't want, or et cetera. So try telling that to Henry Ford. It's a really radically different way of approaching, and it's not the only way in which we're unanticipating. Many, as you also know, many products and services online offer an open API, an open application programming interface, which allows developers anywhere in the world, often without permission, having to require permission, to extend a product, its features, extend its features, introduce features that work for their niche of users, integrate the product into their very particular workflow, their organization's workflow. Or companies like Slack and Dropbox and a million others do this because they know they cannot anticipate everything that every customer and every organization is going to want from their product. So they let the organizations do it. And the third is in the world of electronic games, digital games. Since their beginning, they have enabled users to change the rules, introduce new maps, change the game into something that isn't a game. These are called game mods. And every time a user does this, they are adding value to the product. And so game companies, many of them are quite enthusiastic about enabling users to do this because they cannot anticipate every use, every rule change, every configuration that users will want. So that's the first. I've got two more, but they're shorter. So the first is one of the effects of embracing chaos is we're seeing this rise of unanticipation. The second is that in a overwhelming environment of information, and one in which a very small signal can turn out to have a very large effect, the butterfly effect, then it's important that everybody become a sensor. That's an S-E-N-S-O-R, not a sensor of information, which is the opposite idea. Everybody ought to be looking for these signals and having a very comfortable way of discussing them and making sense of them. And I just noticed this. This seems a little weird. How does it seem to you? That sort of network that allows sense making and amplification is maybe the only way that we have of noticing these small changes that will escape from the purview of experts because they're focused on their field rather than the effects of things that are outside of it. And the third is the rise of distributed decision-making, because hierarchical management was literally invented in order to reduce the information going up so that the person at the top can make a decision. Throwing out information is a bad thing to do unless you really have to. So with distributed decision-making, you leave decisions in the hands of the most local people, but you don't isolate them. You don't turn them into a little pod. They need to be on a supportive network. Because the aim is not to encapsulate expertise, but to expand it, to make it distributed. Distributed decision-making works best when it's not hierarchical in any sense. It's not mirroring that old and traditional approach, but is rather taking on the shape of a network. In fact, the way I would conclude this is to say that I think that already leadership isn't shaped like a pyramid, it's shaped like a network. And that's a proper response to the overwhelming chaotic environment, which has always been the case for humans, but we've been unable to acknowledge that because we've been unable to manage it.
I mean, what a fantastic opening for not even just our panel, but for a conference that is about leadership everywhere, to leave us with that image of leadership is not a pyramid, it's shaped like a network. But rather than engage you on all these fascinating points right now, let's move right on. Alex, I wonder if you can jump in next and give us your perspective on how leadership is facing these new challenges.
Yeah, thank you, Julia, and thanks everyone. This is always a privilege to be here at the forum getting to speak, so never take it for granted that we get to do this and share our views and thoughts with so many people. I guess my thoughts really stem from more of what we see on the ground perspective with real organizations in a day-to-day world around technology and leadership and how they coexist and how they interact. You know, in 1959, when Drucker first mentioned knowledge workers, I've been thinking about what that means today. And today you have many organizations that are converting into digital workforces. And digital workforces clearly are made up of people, but maybe it's a little more provocative to say they also include machines, because some of those machines are automating a number of things in the organization that they weren't doing necessarily 5, even 10 years ago. And while we can make the assumption that most of us are familiar with what's driving these changes, specifically around AI, some of the things that we're seeing, again, at the ground level, include the desire for reducing the marginal costs of transactions. Again, these are some of the most basic drivers for some new technology. How are we freeing up people and resources so they can focus on more valuable work? That's a constant desire for organizations to figure out, especially in a world that has a significant talent gap that it's experiencing around skills and capability. How do we actually provide better customer experience and service? What do we do to improve long-term total cost of ownership, something we've been dealing with forever in business? And again, how do we augment the skills that we do need. These are some of the most basic needs organizations are trying to address with not only the leadership aspect, but also the introduction of modern tech like things around AI. And as leaders, and this is a little similar to what I said in the opening panel discussion this morning, our role continues to be focused on the responsibility for organizing people, the environment, and the culture to best serve the business. But it also includes improving communications. It also means that we have to get very vigilant around governance, organizational design. I loved one of the opening speeches yesterday where one of the speakers said, burn the org chart, you know, thinking about how do you actually bring people together in a different non-hierarchical way. It's not possible in every organization, we know that, but certainly the mindset around trying to evolve some of these changes is important. And when you do consider things like machine learning or even automation, what's driving the demand? The demand is really being driven by some of the needs I spoke of earlier, but it's also driven by how much knowledge content there is to be automated. If you look at something we call a knowledge work spectrum, where we talk about how you automate decisions, and on one end of the spectrum, you have the automation of decision making. On the other end, you have the automation of operations. You know, you have this spectrum, and within it, you have to think about workflows, you have to think about tasks, and then you have to also think about the experience that's required to actually inform you if you're going to automate something differently than the next thing. So I guess the easiest way to say it is the more complex the science, the more access to highly experienced people that can interpret it correctly. And the less complex the science, the less access to experience, and it's more about repetitive cognitive tasks at that point that, you know, that people would undertake. So what does it all mean? For me, I think leaders need to know which type of automation they need most and how to organize it. I think they need to understand, if they're looking at machines and not just people, that the rules that govern the machines have to be led. You know, one of the terms many of you would have heard over the last two forums, and you probably see this in everyday life, is this whole idea around ethical code. And how do we actually write code and create code that incorporates our values and our beliefs around decision making, which is still a very significant area that's under discussion in the market. I like to point to RPA as an example. If you think about robotic process automation, here's an area of technology where you've had many implementations fail because leaders relied more on the tech and they didn't focus on the design, the governance, and the development of skills and mindset to adopt the technology. It's actually not very different than the statistics that tell us that over 70% of digital transformation programs are still struggling or failing. And again, if you go back and you look at the data and then you try to interpret and translate the data, what is it telling us? It's telling us that we have a need for mindset shifts, which I mentioned this morning, and we also have a need to understand how we actually get digital workforces to align across the use of technology differently than they are today. And I'll close with what I mentioned I think it was a couple of years ago at the forum, one of my favorite quotes from Freeman Dyson, the gentleman who replaced Einstein at Princeton, used to say that the digital mind will never replace the analog mind. So I do think part of the need for leadership everywhere is for us to remember we still have to make important decisions in the moment that not every machine will be able to make for us.
Thanks, Alex. That is a great set of perspectives. And I think the umbrella you started out with is just kind of a profound statement that's going to stick with me. And that's just that we now have this workforce, this digital workforce, but that as a leader, you're not just leading people anymore. You're leading this combination of people and smart machines. And so how does that make you think fundamentally differently about what needs to go into your leadership toolkit? Such a terrific question. Let's move on to Charles Édouard. How about if you tell us what's been on your mind lately? I think you're always thinking about this question in some way, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm very happy to be with you again and thrilled to be with you, Julia, on another panel and in the Peter Drucker Forum for so many years. I'll start with I just released the book a few months ago, just before the COVID, which was on the fall of the human empire, memoirs of a robot, sorry. And it's typically along the line of what we are discussing, because at the end, my conviction is we need to be, and I think it was mentioned by my two previous panelists, we need to be led by human leaders. But I see two challenges that we are seeing every day. The first thing is we as humans have never stopped any technology. We didn't stop the nuclear, even though it would have destroyed the planet. We didn't stop bioweapons, and we will not stop AI or algorithmic science in any form. The second thing is it's today bringing us, and we are so happy to have it, a lot of potential, a lot of improvement, a lot of rational. Humans, we are these black boxes, and we are emotional. You had a fight with someone, an argument, you're sick. The way you will decide in the corporate boardroom will be different. So what this algorithm are bringing us, and I think is what we see in this poll, is a bit of rational, helping us. But where we're heading, and I think we are heading to this direction slowly, is what I call from AI to edge AI. It's not hyper AI, it's human augmented intelligence. As we bring this algorithm to all of us, we are having augmented employees, augmented customers, augmented citizens. And as an investor, I've been investing in companies, and maybe we can discuss this when we have the panel discussion of the breakout. I've been investing in companies that do enhance the employees, bringing value to society. And as a conclusion on this, and you mentioned the struggling of implementing AI solution RPA, we as leaders, as humans, have to be augmented leaders. We have to find this right balance between humanity, which is irrational, emotional, organic, and the rational, cold truth of facts. And I think this is what a great leader is, taking the best of the rational, taking the best of the irrational or emotional, and bringing people together.
I mean, I can't resist just asking for a tiny follow-up on that. I love this idea of we need to be augmented leaders. Do you have an example of someone that you've seen augment themselves as a leader with this toolkit?
I'm going to give a more down-to-earth example, which is not about leadership, but about a company we invested in, an American company called Rishti. Basically, what they're doing is you have workers on the factory, and they are doing all these activities, making these widgets, and sometimes they make mistakes. They don't screw the thing rightly, and so on. So what they've done is they have put this camera or this Jiminy Cricket, which is taping them and helping them. So it's not going to their boss. It's just telling them, you missed this or you missed that. So that increases the value added of the work because there's less problems, more quality, and it creates more value for the factory. There is less waste at the end for society. So you can bring technology to people as long as you work together with the person who will be using it, bringing more value to society and helping, because we all in the morning, sometimes we have a bad day, and for a worker, it's even more difficult than for average people.
Great, thank you. And I love that this term augmented intelligence is coming up, now multiple times already. Miriam, let's move on to your comments.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm happy to be part of this wonderful panel, and I think I can relate to some of the remarks you have already heard. So when we talk about using data for augmented leadership, which I really like, Charles Édouard, a very nice term, then I think we have to start from a little bit earlier. We have to keep in mind or understand that we all somehow live in a growing liminal space between data addiction on the one hand side and pure human intuition on the other hand side. And if we remember the poll we did at the beginning of this session, then we saw that like 2/3 really wanted to use data on a daily basis, which is probably the right way to do it. But still, there is a lot to learn how to integrate the data, how to interpret the data, to really bring it together with human capabilities and with decision making that is expected, rightly so, from leaders in our times. So despite of all capabilities of AI, I think we still live in a world of complexity and entropy, and leaders and managers have to be aware of that. And I think regarding this development, some modesty is sometimes also a good choice and helping us to get along well. So let me give you two examples that might underline what I want to get across. The first one is, we're talking about the capabilities of AI, for example, new multi-agent artificial intelligence models, so-called MAAI. And those models make it possible to predict the behavior of, for example, an epidemic, for example, entire urban transport systems, entire countries, what have we. And at some point that really worked out well, though it might sound hyperbolic in the first place. First successes have been achieved in this field. So let me give you one example. When Ebola broke out in West Africa in 2014, the US Defense Threat Reduction Agency used computer models to calculate the potential spread of this epidemic. And over a period of 7 months, computer scientists built an agent-based model that was fed with a lot of real data, like population data, like economic data, like data on social interactions, of course, travel routes, even cultural rites, like funeral customs and all those kinds of things. Everything was included. So the model calculated a spread of the epidemic, Ebola, in 2014, and this spread would affect 1.4 million people. That was what the prediction said. So everything was prepared, emergency interventions, medical measures, and so on. Now, in the end, affected by this outbreak of Ebola were 28,000 people. You see, we have 1.4 million in the prediction, 28,000 in reality. So that's a good outcome, actually, when a prediction goes wrong. But we have to see that we also have the example for the other way around, and that is actually COVID-19. So if you look back on what has happened over the last month, one has to say, if you look back over the last years, we could have known, actually, because, for example, in 2012, a risk analysis study from the German government presented a very comprehensive documentation on a possible pandemic caused by a virus, Modi SARS. And that was basically driven by the German Robert Koch Institute, the country's disease control and prevention organization. And together with other federal authorities, they came up with a prediction scenario that said that 6 million Germans would be falling ill at the peak of the imagined crisis. Another one jumping in was Bill Gates. He warned in a 2015 TED Talk that a virus epidemic is the greatest threat, or would be the greatest threat to mankind. And as recently as last year, 2019, the US government agencies ran a full-scale simulation codenamed Crimson Contagion, bearing a frightened resemblance to the coronavirus crisis we are going through now. So this is very interesting. If you look at what even large technical model predictions come up with, then we, on the one hand side, have they produce errors in a good way, while making us believe that the damage will be big, and then it's not, or producing something that we just should have taken a look at while we didn't. And so I think taking these examples into account, one might come up with 3 ideas talking about what leadership, or how leadership is challenged by the situation we are in right now, this liminal space between data addiction and the human intuition. And the first one is a rule I think we can derive from biology, and that might be interesting to keep in mind, that complex life can only become more complex by selection. It will never become easier. We can apply whatever AI we have. It will never become easier. The second one is something that came to my mind while thinking about these examples and scenarios. And I'm relating to the former United States Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, whom I'm not quoting regularly, but this quote from 2002 is a very interesting one to reconsider these days. Because Rumsfeld stated, and I'm quoting him now, "Reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also, and this is interesting, there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and other free countries, it is the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones. And I think in that he was true, while unintentionally describing the situations we are in right now. There are unknown unknowns, and there will ever be unknown unknowns in spite of applying data analytics and artificial intelligence. I really appreciate that. And I really think the opportunities are large in applying these technologies of machine learning, like David said, but still there are unknown unknowns. So that's the second insight. And the third insight is, I think especially particular leaders have to keep that in mind. There are unknown unknowns even in our data-driven and extensively analyzed world. And they will be bringing serendipity to our lives, to our societies, to our economies. And that might be benevolent serendipity, or it might be malevolent serendipity. And so we need to be vigilant, and we need to be somehow prepared for these unknown unknowns. And we also need to be willing and able to react swiftly and consistently. And I would call that adaptability. And that is, as to my perception, the most important skill of these days. Maybe you can relate that to the augmented leadership that Charles Édouard was talking about, but I would say adaptability, changing and very volatile process of adaptation. That's what this is all about.
And the adaptability point, I would say, not only relates to what Charles Édouard was saying, but very much to what David was saying about, unanticipation. I mean, if you have this unanticipation strategy, then the implication is that you are constantly in an agile mode, tacking without that beautiful predictability that we crave so much as humans. Let's just mix it up a little bit and get you all responding to what each other said. I have some questions that I could pose, but before I do, David, is there anything you heard from others that you'd like to pick up on, or Alex or anyone else?
Can I swiftly take up something that David has posted in the chat, because I think
great.
That is,
please, yeah, good.
That is really, really important what David has posted in the chat, that we might be learning about probabilities by thinking about these things we have all been talking about. Because if we understand the concept of probability, then we know that even if the probability is like 5%, something can still happen to us. And I think this is something like an education process of thinking strategies and imagination strategies that we really have to keep in mind. I like that a lot.
Thank you. And I really like yours. One of the things I was in response, I was going to say, is the emphasis on humility, that this is something really important for humans to learn. And I think I actually have some hope that AI is going to, it's training us how to think. This is generally the case with our tech, that we start understanding ourselves and our world in terms of the tech that we use every day. And one of the lessons of AI is that it is often, not always, but it's often inexplicable to us, and yet seems to be probabilistically right. That's why we use it. We use it for weather, even though in weather we actually are trained to expect expressions of probability, 30% chance of rain or whatever. This may be something that I hope we will learn from AI models, that they are complex, and always increasingly complex, as Miriam says, because the world is the black box. Ultimately, that's the black box, and the world is infinitely complex. So as we are able to benefit from larger and larger slices of that infinite complexity, I hope that we learn that surprises are always possible. In fact, what Miriam is calling serendipity, which is a perfectly right word for it, especially if you take serendipity as both positive and negative, as you did, Miriam. Then a traditional way of talking about this in Western philosophy anyway, is in terms of accidents, which we now think of, at least in the US, primarily as traffic accidents and the like, but it's the sudden occasion of something that you did not anticipate. And often it's negative, but often it's not. And what I think ultimately we are seeing in the West, and I sort of hope this is the case, is a movement away from the arrogant certainty that once we know the laws of the universe, and we're very good at finding these big generalizations, we can apply them in a way that gives deductive certain results. But all of our experience has said otherwise. We still continue to believe that what's important and where the truth is in these general laws. But we also should have learned that applying them perfectly is literally impossible. We can know everything, even in physics, but we don't know the pull of every distant star, the gravitational pull of every star, which is part of the universe. So if AI is enabling us to make better decisions, probabilistic, by advising us or even maybe making decisions at times for us, something we need to be talking about, as others have raised. If it's taking us away from this notion that, whoa, we know the laws of the universe, we can apply them and have deductive certainty, and it's instead getting us used to the idea that, no, the world is all accidents. Ultimately, everything is an accident. It's caused by the interaction of literally everything affecting everything else all the time, every moment. Everything is an accident. And the general laws are helpful and good. I like science, I like physics, but our everyday experience in the world and in business is accidents that have some probabilities. And that's humbling to know.
You know, I'm reminded from what you're saying about that old saying, I can't remember who said it first, but that the map is not the territory, and that the territory is unbelievably complex. But the models we create are simplistic maps that then may oversimplify and sort of even blind us to the true complexity and true chaos of the world that we live in. Alex, I want to go back to something that you stressed, which, you know, when I think about how does the data-driven organization, the smart machine-filled workplace change the work of leaders? One thing you said was, you know, it's up to leaders to figure out how these machines will free up people's mind share to take on more, you know, more of the work that still requires human skills. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that. I mean, it seems like leaders' whole mindset about automation really has to change in a way where they have been thinking about it as sort of replacing that expensive wetware. Now they need to think about leveraging that expensive wetware. And so have you seen anyone doing that well, or can you put any finer point on how leaders should think about that?
Well, I still think the challenge with this topic is that, and this goes back to the days when, you know, even really good software applications started becoming mainstream, and we started using things like Office or Jira or any tool that we've bought to try and simplify our life. You end up relying on the tool, but not necessarily understanding that you have to make some behavioral changes as well in how you operate. And I think one of the things we see at a large scale in organizations is this whole idea that these mindset shifts don't typically occur at the same pace as the implementation or introduction of new tech. And so this is my whole point about RPA. There's nothing wrong with RPA as a technology, but the reason that you have these, or many of these implementations failing or not working as intended, is because no one took into consideration at the onset that we had to sit down with our teams. And by the way, when we say leaders, leaders are in all parts of an organization. So, and actually helping them adapt the thinking behind how to use something. I guess it's almost a question I have as much as a statement, and I love what David just shared. I'm not sure that I believe everything's an accident, but I would ask and challenge us to think, is there a concern that with more and more automation, as leaders, we might become dumb, or we might just forget learning, or kind of drop off some of the learning that we need to keep going in our own, in our own environments? Because this is one of the challenges with relying more and more on tech. It kind of takes away, for some, the desire to keep going in leadership roles and thinking that they can pass it off to a machine. This is why I think the idea of having to manage a machine, which does sound provocative, and I know some folks disagree with that principle. Well, the more machines you have making decisions for your company and for your customers, the more ground rules you have to establish for those machines. And where do those ground rules come from? They come from you as a leader. You have to think about what you're going to build into that code and how it's going to execute without any human intervention. Because one of the other things that's missing here is empathy. Machines don't have empathy. And I think part of the challenge around being a human and having humility, which I loved when David said that, and that was mentioned, you have to also have empathy. You have to know how to actually feel and work with something like this in an environment where you're not relying just on code.
Great. And, I am really taken by this kind of thought you put in the air that there may be a certain learned helplessness that could result from the over-reliance on, anyway, I'm going to keep thinking about that. Charles Édouard, this coming back to the point you also made about human augmented intelligence, that it's HAI that we need to be thinking about. Can you just say what you think the human part still is? Like what is the part that the AI can't do that we have to leverage better?
Yes, thanks. I will take 3 points quickly. The first one was asked to me in the group chat, but how I was making decision on using data. As a consultant and a CEO of a consulting firm, I was very biased because I was very analytical. And to answer your question, Julia, it's all this invisible listening. I think David mentioned we are not an hierarchy, we are in a network. And I made my best decision when I was looking at the fact in the eyes, right in the eyes, at the same time listening to the people. And what would be the right solution when I was leading China or when I was leading a German company. The second thing, and it was mentioned by Miriam, is this unknown. For machines, there's not such thing as an unknown because it's algorithmic science. So if you think about our life, the most difficult for all of us is not the thing we know. It's the thing we were not prepared. If you're insured for something, which all the machine will be because algorithmic science, it's not a problem. This is a human problem. Last but not least, and I think it was David and Alex mentioning it, is serendipity. Think about all the great invention. Think about all the great things you did in your life, bumping into someone, meeting someone, getting something incredible done that would not have been done by machine. Because, I was in Hong Kong last week. I just flew back from Asia with a professor, and we were talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the question was, which level of entropy did you put in the model? If you decide to have a very low level of entropy, of course, every morning you will wake up at the same time, you have the same coffee or tea, the same food, everything will be fine. If you accept to have more entropy, then you will bump into someone else, the coffee will speed, there will be another discussion with your wife, significant other, and the life will be different. So I think to answer your question, but what is the human part? The human part is this mix of people around you, organic materials, unknown, and serendipity. And that cannot be done by machines. This is what I wrote as a conclusion in the book. And that's why the book is a positive thinking on the world, not just a fall of the human empire. So a long answer to your short question.
That was a good answer to my short question. Look, it's a good moment now to bring in, I feel like I've been monopolizing the questions here, and a lot of other people have some very good questions. Thanks, by the way, to the panelists who've already picked up on some of what we see going on in the chat. I also want to remind people that you can continue to post questions, and that you should be doing that. If you're using Slido, druckerforum.com, then please post those questions using the hashtag DruckerForum, hashtag that's just hashtag DruckerForum put together, and then we'll be sure to pick up on them and be able to pull them into the conversation. For the moment though, in the chat, I wonder if I could ask Neil to just unmute and ask the question that you posed in chat, because it's a great one. It's taking advantage of the fact that our panel actually has CEOs. we have people here who have built businesses for themselves. And so do you mind, Neil, are you there? And can you just ask your question yourself?
I can. Julia, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, thanks.
Thank you. I didn't think I'd be on the spot, but yeah, I was just wondering, because we have practitioners in the room, either current or former, it would be great to understand the real key drivers on data and how much they were driven by it, but also possibly thinking over the years, how did they change their decision making in terms of data? Because obviously we now know that there's more and more data available. So maybe some of them who had 10 years of, say, 5 years, when they started, what were they interested in? And by the time they ended, what were they interested in? Thank you.
And Miriam, can I go first to you with this? I mean, after all, you built this absolutely digital business. So to hear your thinking about this would be great.
Yes, I'm happy to. So as to my experience, basically, let me put it like that. If you don't look at the data and take care of having the right data at hand to make your decisions, you're really lost. And we are currently going through a period where we see, for example, in the media industry, that companies haven't taken care of that. And now they realize that the world has basically changed. And the only way to survive lies in really understanding what the users do and want and prefer. And the data are just not there in some spots, especially in Europe, to take care of that in the way that it should be professionally done. So I think, yes, data at hand is absolutely necessary. And in terms of innovation, some industries should have started much earlier to really implement that. Also regarding setting up platform strategies in terms of using data as a whole industry, in spite of competition issues, because some of the data are really necessary at large scale to really be interpreted and get results very quickly that go beyond the restrictions of the companies, of one's own company's perspective. Let me add one more thing, because I think that's also important for the discussion we're right in. When we talk about using data and learning from data and learning to use data, we're in a process that is basically a social interaction. For a social interaction, you don't need two humans. You can also have a social interaction between a machine and a human, and a learning process comes out of that. There's a wonderful paper by Édouard from the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, and many other international researchers called machine behavior. And they argue basically that whenever a human interacts with a machine or interacts with large data sets, that's a learning process, and it will change how we are set up in our thinking, in our decision making. And I think if you even look into the future, you will find that this will play a large role. And we will also have to take into account that also machines might be able to be in a conversation with each other, which they are already in a way. And they might go through a learning process that we as humans can't even follow up with. So that is a really interesting perspective in using data also from a social science, behavioral perspective that hasn't been researched much up to now, but it will impact our decision making in ways we can't even imagine now.
We're going to momentarily go into breakout sessions, but I think this is such a great question to set up those breakouts, that before we do that, I want to also hear what Alex has to say about this as a CEO and business builder who is also very digitally oriented. And then after that, I think we'll go to breakouts, let you think about other questions that come up and come back to more of your questions. Alex, go ahead.
Thanks, Julia. It's a great question. I've been trying to think of my answer since the question was asked by Neil. I would say in my role, and even going back, if I'm just thinking back just a decade, I think the reliance on data is still, it's marginal. And what I mean is the data, when we look at data in the business and how we make data-driven decisions, the data is important, of course, to do analysis, but I always go back to something that a data scientist named David Robinson coined. It was a phrase called scientific debt, and scientific debt is when a team takes shortcuts in data analysis or practices or in monitoring of data, and it can have a long-term negative consequence. And scientific debt isn't necessarily bad, because in the spirit of MVPs, when you build, a minimum viable product quickly, you do that by foregoing other things. But the reality is, there are sometimes shortcuts or attempts at carving up data that may result in the data not being completely accurate. So for me, in my role, I would say there's still no substitute for human conversations. There's no substitute for sitting down and getting, feedback from users, customers, or anyone in the communities that we touch, so we can understand perspectives and views that then we go back and correlate with the data that helps us make decisions. So I don't foresee a future, and I could be ignorant on this one, where a machine will give me enough accurate data that will remove, even 50% of my ability to make a choice or a decision for the business.
Thanks, Alex. So just one more thing before we move to breakouts. David, I think you have a question that you wanted to pose to Miriam.
Yeah, I'd feel bad if we went into breakout without having at least mentioned the bias problem, which I know, Miriam, you have studied deeply. I think of it as the original sin of machine learning, since it's sort of baked into how machine learning works from the very beginning. So what do we do about that, Miriam?
Well, actually, I think, David, the first thing that would be great was to know about it, because it's still a situation where you run into people, even business people, who have no idea what this bias really means. And that sometimes freaks me out, to be very clear about that, because basically, if you take historical data and put them in a machine learning model and then take out a result, you have a biased result, because the data is, of course, what influences the result of the whole modeling. And so we need to find a way to collect our data from each and every part of economy, society, different backgrounds, diverse backgrounds of people, of decision making. And that is probably an issue that, of course, can't be solved by some political regulation or what. But as far as we haven't really come up with a solution for that, we always will be facing a biased result. And so basically, you could say that AI systems or machine learning systems deepen social gaps and even make it harder for people in a difficult position to improve their position, because they are in a vicious circle. They are trapped in a vicious circle if you just rely on historical data. So I have no clear concept of how to solve it, but I think basically we have a lot of discussion going on how to include more diverse data, and that will make for a more diverse outcome and more real modeling of such systems.
Okay, great. Look, thank you for that, David, and thank you, Miriam. Now let's move into breakouts, and let's just take our cue from the terrific question that Neil presented to our speakers and expand it to all of you. Kind of in your own experience, has data changed the way that you lead or others around you lead? And maybe you can think of an example to share in your small peer groups. about something that maybe in the past would have been a judgment call that has now been more informed by data. So Christine, can you put us into those breakouts now?
Yes, thank Hi, Julia, welcome back. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I didn't realize I should be jumping back in so quickly.
All good, fantastic. People are in breakout rooms now. We will be back in a few minutes. A good question they're sent away with. For everyone who's still here with us in the room, I thought, Julia, maybe we open up the floor for them as well to discuss here because they couldn't move to breakout rooms. So would you want to do that?
Yeah, sure. We have our own. We have our own
breakout room on the main stage.
And I see some familiar names. Bill Fisher, for example. Bill, why don't you unmute and say hello?
Hi, I've been silently taking notes for the post-program, review. But this has been great. This has been terrific so far. And I'm working with an AI startup, and I'm particularly impressed by the idea that David shared about, everything is an accident, and we need to be thinking about unanticipation as a strategic approach.
Yeah, I like that too. It's almost like to think metaphorically. If you're driving down the highway at highway speed, then you can either think about trying to get better headlights, or you can think about getting better reflexes. Like the headlights could maybe predict further into the future, but if you give up on that, then you just need to be able to respond much more readily. Oh my goodness. Go ahead. Go ahead.
If I could just reintroduce Hire, who has been a longtime supporter of the Drucker Forum. I mean, that's what they're doing by putting people into micro enterprises and getting rid of corporate strategy and allowing the micro enterprises to place bets on the future. And then the strategy becomes the ex post rationalization of those choices, I think.
Hal Gregerson, I'm so happy to see your face here. And I don't know if you've been listening this whole time, but you must have loved hearing the unknown unknowns reference. I know that's a favorite one of yours. Oh, you're on mute.
I was just going to say I've had some technical issues with cameras that I've been trying to resolve, and I've half resolved it. So I just barely joined, sadly. So it sounds like it was really good.
Yeah, and early on in the
She went. We've lost her.
Seems like we have lost her for a moment, maybe an unstable internet connection, but I'm sure she will be right back. So feel free to continue.
Bill, how are you doing? Christine, I joined late, so I'm just going to stay in this room, not go to the breakouts.
Yes, of course, you're very welcome to do that. People will be coming back in a few minutes, so don't worry.
That sounds good. Thanks.
So who here in the room can give Hal a bit of a briefing? Bill, maybe.
Hi, Hal. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Bill.
Yeah, I miss you. It's been a really interesting conversation about dealing with the combination of machines, machine learning and and artificial intelligence and leadership and people. And I think one of the things that would resonate with you is the idea of not only the augmented employee or the augmented customer, but the augmented leader as well.
Absolutely.
And what that might mean, So that was one of the things I thought there was so much here. I'm doing the note taking for the session, and I have about 8 pages of notes already. It's I don't know where to start.
Wow. So are there any lines or key thoughts that like really popped for you?
Well, Miriam talked about complex life can only become more complex.
Wow.
It'll never get simpler. There was the idea that now out of my notes, but that we're living in chaos, and the idea is that what if we were to accept on a philosophical basis that everything is really an accident, that in fact literally the world as we know it is the result of accidents. How would we behave and how would we structure organizations differently? What would it mean to us as leaders? What would our style be? And I think that I see that in organizations that are redistributing decision making. Also, the ability to allow people to change the rules. So we tend, so much of what we take for granted, like warranties and guarantees and things of that nature, are premised on the belief that the rules are set by somebody else always. And if we conform to those rules, we'll be protected in some way. But what if the making is distributed? How does that change not only the world we live in, but the decision making that goes into our assumptions of predictability? I think what's interesting to me, I think if I move away from my notes and try to think like a human being, Which I would try never to. I don't even have a real background, you know. I mean, I'm here in sort of constructed space. You know, it seems to me that that what we have is we have this ability to use data in ways that haven't been used before, but we have this sentimentality about the social structure of work in the past, and somehow the two are contradictory. And I don't want to give up the social context of the past, but it's holding me back from reimagining what we might do in the future.
I can see that. No, we are tiptoeing our way into a different reality.
Yes, maybe, if we allow our toes to tip.
Well, I think the ongoing pandemic will force our toes to tip.
Right.
It's not going to be over for, who knows, 6, 12 months, and even then, who knows if it'll be over. And I think we'll really have to face some of those things you're describing in a nice way. Yeah.
You know, I work. I think I mentioned this earlier. I'm on the board of a startup that uses AI to produce patentable inventions, and
Wow.
And when we prototype this in potential customer environments, they're just overwhelmed by the process. It's not the outcome. The outcome is fundamentally different by an order of magnitude from what they've had in the past, but the processes, they've never had to deal with so much data, and they don't, you know, how you do it and how you organize and how you make choices are things that they're really unprepared for.
Yeah.
If I may interrupt here for a second, gentlemen, thank you. Welcome back. I see that people came back from the breakout rooms, so we are back on the main stage, and I see, Julia, you're also back with us.
Good.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks for taking over.
And I kind of bounced around amongst a couple of the breakout sessions, and there were absolutely interesting conversations. It makes me miss so much being in the hallways in Vienna and being able to then pour out the session afterwards and keep talking about it. But we'll do it virtually in the absence of that. I want to go back to some questions that people have been posting through chat and Slido and the other mechanisms. I wonder if Miriam Kurtzig could, Miriam, if you're still online there, could you unmute and maybe express your question yourself? If not, I'll read it out.
Yes, thank you. Actually, my name is Miriam Friedman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I know it went in the wrong way.
Oh, go right ahead.
Anyway, this question we discussed in the breakout room, so I don't want to be boringly repetitious, but what I wanted to know was about data-driven. So I work in public education in the United States. Everything is data-driven, everything. And yet, what is it? Whose data? What is collected? And does it actually answer the questions we want answered? How to help children learn? I find it extremely problematic. Too often, the data is not leading us toward better education. And I just pose that as a challenge for all of us. Yes, we have more data. And no, we don't have better learning. So not that one is necessarily cause and effect, but presumably we want to collect data to improve schooling.
I mean, I love this example that you put on the table for us because it's something that we can all relate to. Whether, I mean, we don't all work in education, but we've all experienced it, and many of us have children who are still in the system, and this is a big change that has happened. So panelists, who wants to take this one first? Please just unmute yourself and jump in. Actually, David?
Well,
would
I
you like to?
I could do it as we share the first name.
Yes. Yes.
And we
That's-
also share working and learning, because I'm running a learning company, and I think that is very thoughtful of you how you put it, because of course it's not about collecting all the data and then thinking in a stimulus response model the outcome will be better. Of course not. It might even get worse. So the fact is that we again need to learn how to interpret the data and how to turn the data into something what is, in our case, from a pedagogical perspective, making sense to young people, to students, whomever we have in the audience and want to work with. And that is, for example, a very, very huge task that probably can be better done by humans, because you need empathy, you need emotional intelligence, you need the experience of interacting with pupils, with students, with people, with grown-up people even. And so again, the complementarity of having the data and understanding, for example, the expectations, the needs, the skill levels of the people you have in your class, in your courses, is one really great thing. But then turning it into something meaningful as an offering for the people to learn and to teach each other, to interact with each other on, that is something totally different. And that's not in the data, that's in our brains, in our hearts, and everything we can give to that.
Can I add on to that? That's a wonderful answer. There's another slice through it though, which is, and I've recommended Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, in the chat, where she does a really great job talking about this sort of thing. It raises another issue with AI, which these are just stupid machines. I mean, they're just machines. They don't care about anything at all. Thus, no empathy, no passion, no nothing. But that means that we have to be able to tell them what we care about. And in education, Kathy O'Neill's, one of her examples is using AI to evaluate teachers. We have to be able to tell it in the language of AI what we count as valuable in teachers. And this is something we don't talk about very often, and we certainly don't agree about. And if we don't agree about it, we can't tell the system whether a successful teacher is one whose kids go on to college, kids are able to enter trades successfully, kids who 10 years later are married and not divorced, or I don't know, right? What do we count as a successful teacher? And if we can't figure that out, then we cannot instruct the AI in a meaningful way. And one of the good things about it, there's a terrible problem, one of the good things about AI is it forces us to have those conversations. Because unless we do, we're only going to get the sort of terrible responses that we generally get from the educational application of AI.
That's good. That's a good point.
It's a good question.
I'm just going to underscore that, since Hal Gregerson is listening in, that thing that David just said about AI forcing the right questions.
Yeah, that's good.
I think that's a very good way of thinking about how it can create some better leadership in the world. I want to stick with the education, I guess, because I just think we can all relate to it. But I'm also going to bring in another question that came from Julius. Julius, your question about centralized power, do you want to express it yourself?
Sure, thank you very much. Yeah, yesterday we had a short discussion during one of the panel discussions whether data and data-driven management is actually a tool to centralize even more the power, because it can be used to control even more in detail what the workforce is doing, or is it a tool to distribute power and to distribute decision making, and does it thus help for decentralized organizations and decision making? So I would be curious about the thoughts of our panelists here.
And I love that question. And again, maybe if we can just think about it within this realm of education and the complaint that we've just heard from Miriam, which, I think the way that she was describing it does sort of imply that this data environment is being used to centralize some things that maybe shouldn't be so centralized, and to put some decision making power in the wrong hands or something like that. Alex, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I have a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, on this, so maybe lessons learned for us as an organization this year. We had some people in our leadership team point out that because of COVID and lockdown and the way we all responded to it, some of the decentralized decision making around the globe kind of came back in. It became more centralized. In a bit of an unknown way, we seem to, at a moment, put our arms around it. And actually, this lends itself back to one of the points I was making this morning on this morning's panel about leadership rising to the occasion, that there's a need for us to consistently be cultivating a culture of empowerment and not a culture of control. And this is, again, a lesson we've had to learn too, where our default nature is to get our arms around things and maybe not even maliciously or knowingly communicate a lack of trust inside the organization, when really what we should be doing is taking that data and putting it back into the hands of the people we're trusting to make decisions with it. So we went through this small learning lesson this year, and we've been back on the pace of getting things back out to teams and simplifying processes and decision-making criteria, using the data that we have to run our own organization, so we don't foster a culture of control. We all want to say the right things, but the reality is we like putting our arms around the business and holding it tight, so we get to be the deciding factor with some areas of the company. So I do think that's a really good question. It's a really good point for people to consider. You know, are we responding to the change in our climate by taking things back in, because we're fearful that if we can't be with the organization in the way we were with them, 8 months ago, that somehow decisions won't get made the way we want them to.
And I don't want to leave Charles Édouard out of this conversation. What would you have to say about this question about centralized or decentralized?
I think it's both. I think, Julia, you should remember a conversation we had many years ago at the Peter Drucker Forum on my previous book, which was called Light Footprint Management. And on light footprint management, it has nothing to do with AI, it has to do with technology. The technology are allowing us to be at the same time able to centralize and decentralize. We can have the soldiers on the battlefield making the decision by their own, getting all the information downstairs, and you can have the commander-in-chief to see what's happening, in the line of combat. And this is happening in many companies. So I think we should not oppose both. It's just we have the luck to live in companies in a world where we can do both, and it can be evil on both sides. It can be evil downstairs when the underground people are making the wrong decision consciously, and it can be bad if centrally, using all this data, people are making the wrong decisions consciously, knowing that the data is biased. So I think we are living in a world which is both centralized and decentralized at the same time, and we have to accept this. There's no right or wrong answer on this one.
On this decentralized, centralized question, I'm coming back to one point that David made in his very beginning remarks, which was everyone becomes a sensor. And I think that's a really important way of thinking about, this leadership everywhere topic of our entire conference. But David, maybe you can say a little bit more about that, and what, if as a leader, you're thinking about everyone in your organization as a sensor, what does that mean you need to do better as a leader?
That's at least the fourth time. You have to learn to trust open conversation on networks, not see it always as a distraction from work. Because I'll give you a quick example. A long time ago, I worked at a company that was doing early WYSIWYG publishing stuff, and there was which required basically having our own printers. Long story, I'll skip that. And we were having an issue with the hardware that we were developing to support our software, and the group that came up with the answer was the set of gamers among the engineers, and not just engineers, because they play video games and they had a lively discussion. And in one sense, that's a distraction from work. That's a waste of time, arguably so. But that's where they were, in fact, not on purpose, but developing huge expertise about, for example, graphics boards. And so it was that group just talking amongst themselves that figured out what the problem was. You cannot, given everything that everybody has said, including all the discussion of the unknown unknowns, which is life, right? I mean, that's, and the source of humility as well. You don't know what's going to be important. You don't know what a signal is. You don't know what it is that often usually takes human intelligence. And so having an open network where somebody can say, wow, I just read this thing about something else, about gaming, and it seems weird to me. What do you think? And having a conversation with like-minded people that develop an idea, that's where the ideas get tested and expanded and contextualized. And if it turns out it's interesting, then having an open network that's able to share all of this. If we believe that human conversation is the greatest form of intelligence, it's not one person, it's us talking together, as I think most of us do believe in a Drucker world, then you need both a culture and the infrastructure is easy, the culture is harder. You need a culture that enables and encourages all forms of digression for people to talk about what's interesting to them. And what's interesting to other people is not up to you and cannot be predicted. So.
We're down to kind of the literal end of our time together. But before I don't know, Miriam, do you want to just do a 30-second response, have the last word here, and then, but in the meantime, everyone listening in, if you can think about the final comment you might make on what you take away from this session and be posting it into our chat space. Miriam, final word, and then Christine, you can take over with the last bit of housekeeping.
Wow, thanks, Julia. Yeah, I try to do that. It's not easy because we had a lot of great contributions, but I think as to my perception, what came out was that we are somewhere in the middle of a process of getting to know how to use data and data analytics and machine learning, AI, to really understand the world we're in better, make better decisions, and that's great in the first place. And then still keeping up with our human approach and trying to put this all together into something that might be better than what we have right now. And I just posted in the chat and would like to repeat it, though the words might be not that nice. It's all about how we think about contributing to what might come up in the future. So if we build the process and we build the technology as humans, if we build the process of AI getting more and more into involved into our decision making, then we have to do it in the right way, in a good way. And we have to think about bias and all the impact that might come with it in the long term. So if we have a shitty process in real life, and we have lots of shitty processes in real life, and we digitize these shitty processes, then we have shitty digital processes in the next future, and we don't want that. So it's very, very important to think about it now and make it something better than we have, and use the capabilities and the opportunities in putting AI and human intelligence together.
I mean, that's a terrific note to end on. David Weinberger is underscoring the use of the technical term there in the chat. Christine, I'll let you take over from here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julia, for guiding us through this amazing panel. I want to thank all the panelists here who participated and took the time to share your insights. I see David is already celebrating with a little emoji here. Thank you. Thank you, David. And thank you to all of our participants who joined us in this session. I already read some comments in the chat. Édouard, thank you for your comment. Data-driven, intelligent conversation. Thank you so much for participating, sending over your questions on for the speakers. And yeah, I wish you a fantastic rest of the conference. Feel free to check our program for the other sessions. or just swing by the networking lounge at any given point. It's open all day for a few more hours. So just swing by, get to know some people. It's been really busy and fun already of what I've heard there. Maybe I'm also going to be there at one point to see who's there. And yes, I wish you a fantastic conference. Stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks for tuning in. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.